History as it happens, September 13th, 2022. The Carter Comparison.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
Let our recent mistakes bring a resurgent commitment to the basic principles of our nation.
Today's OPEC increases are expected to drive the price of unleaded up to a national average of 77 cents.
A more serious domestic problem. That problem is inflation. All of us must learn to waste less energy.
People who want to work but can't find jobs are part of today's other bad economic...
It is a crisis of confidence.
Some 60 Americans are now beginning their 6th day of captivity inside.
In the Iran crisis, which has held world attention for 87 days now.
The government of Iran must recognize the gravity of the situation which it has itself created.
But to my deep regret, 8 of the crewmen of the 2 aircraft which collided were killed.
Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
Jimmy Carter may have been a bad president, but he had a lot of bad luck. Even so, he looked like a man who had lost control of events, unable to effectively lead, prone to unforced errors. Is Joe Biden following in Carter's footsteps? That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear. This is America's day. This is democracy's day. A day of history and hope, of renewal and resolve.
Look at prices across the board. Food prices have now been up for 17 consecutive months, up 9.
The assumption was that more than 300,000 Afghan national security forces that we had trained over the past 2 decades and equipped would be a strong adversary. Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans represent an extremism that threatens the very foundations of our republic.
During the past 3 years, I've spoken to you on many occasions about national concerns, the energy crisis, reorganizing the government, our nation's economy, and issues...
On June 15th, 1979, President Carter looked into Americans' living rooms and delivered a sermon that would define his presidency, although not in the way he had intended. Unemployment, inflation, the energy crisis, long, angry lines at gas stations... They were all important, but something bigger, deeper was eroding the foundations of American society.
I want to talk to you right now about a fundamental threat to American democracy. I do not mean our political and civil liberties. They will endure. And I do not refer to the outward strength of America, a nation that is at peace tonight everywhere in the world, with unmatched economic power and military might. The threat is nearly invisible in ordinary ways. It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation.
At the heart of this crisis of confidence, soulless materialism.
Too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. Human identity is no longer defined by what one does, but by what one owns.
What became known as the malaise speech received a favorable initial response. But as Carter's words continued to sink in, they rebounded on a president whose approval ratings had never been very good. Almost from the start of his presidency, the nation's economic problems dogged Carter's agenda. And the new president seemed to have as few allies on the left as he did on the right. Carter and the liberals did not see eye to eye. And as bad as things were in mid-1979, inflation was more than 13%. They got worse at the end of the year.
In Iran, there have been new threats against the hostages. Threats inspired by the new United States policy that does not any longer rule out the use of...
Iranian militants seized dozens of American hostages at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, dealing Carter an intractable problem, one that he tried to solve the following spring with Operation Eagle Claw.
There was no fighting. There was no combat. but to my deep regret, 8 of the crewmen of the 2 aircraft which collided were killed, and several other Americans were hurt in the accident.
So all of this is why historian Sean Wilentz has said Carter's best day as president may have been his first. It's not that he accomplished nothing. The 1978 Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel were one of his achievements. But for most of his presidency, Jimmy Carter looked like a man struggling to lead, to connect with ordinary Americans, as the problems kept piling up, whether they were his fault or not. I started thinking about Jimmy Carter as I read stories this summer about Democrats whispering they wanted someone else to run for president in 2024, that Joe Biden, his approval rating stuck in the low to mid-40s, had lost the narrative. Inflation, high gas prices, the fiasco in the closing days of the U.S. mission in Afghanistan, all reminders of Carter's woes. In 1980, Ted Kennedy challenged Carter for the Democratic nomination, and in doing so, badly damaged the incumbent in his campaign against Ronald Reagan.
The work goes on, the cause endures, the hope still lives, and the dream shall never die.
Well, it's not clear today if Biden will face any kind of left-wing insurgency. Depending on how the midterm elections go, maybe he'll come out of it stronger. Maybe by 2024, inflation will be a memory. And maybe Biden won't face a strong Republican opponent. Too many unknowns at this point, but the comparison is still worth considering because presidents are a little like quarterbacks. They get too much credit when the team wins and too much blame when they lose. Yet they still are the most important position on the field. Scott Kaufman is a professor at Francis Marion University and the author of The Presidency of James Earl Carter Jr., now in its 2nd edition. Scott Kaufman, welcome.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here.
So, Scott, I've been meaning to do an episode about Jimmy Carter and relevant comparisons to Joe Biden's presidency ever since I saw a front-page article in the New York Times Sunday, June 12th. Biden in 2024, many in party whisper no. For Democrats, doubts on age and tenacity, read the headline. So no comparison or analogy is perfect, I'm sure you agree, and it is just as important to point out where historical parallels fail to clarify, as it is to underscore how they might help us understand the present. Maybe we'll start there. Have you been thinking about this comparison at all?
A little bit. I've been thinking, for instance, about the issue of messaging. One of the things that I am critical of Carter about in my writings is that one thing I think that Americans like is a president who can offer a vision, an idea of where he plans on taking the country. Carter had a very difficult time when it came to promoting a vision. And while Joe Biden did have one, Build Back Better, it seemed to disappear. So I think it left a lot of Americans wondering, okay, we have all these policy proposals. What's the bigger picture here? Where does he plan on leading the nation? And I do see that comparison.
They are two very different people. They're contemporaries, both in the same generation for the most part. And what I mean by is that they're getting up there in age. Of course, Carter is quite old. But they're very different people, very different speaking styles. You know, when I watch Carter's speeches, he's very good. But he comes off as a little sanctimonious, sermonizing, whereas Biden, not to sound unkind, maybe you disagree with this, stumbles and bumbles his way through speeches often.
Yeah, sometimes he does, but he has also delivered speeches that have come across really well. I mean, the last speech he gave, which was a very politicized speech, I freely admit, he did seem to get a lot of kudos for that and the way he presented it. I'm not talking about what he said, the way he presented it.
That in America, we're all created equal. This is where the United States Constitution was written and debated. This is where we set in motion the most extraordinary experiment of self-government the world has ever known.
But yeah, he does at times have issues when it comes to presenting material. But, you know, you couldn't draw an analogy there with Carter in the sense that sometimes Carter would give speeches and he would kind of say two different messages at the same time, especially when it came to foreign policy issues. And it would leave Americans wondering, what in the world was he talking about? So if we're talking about delivery, yeah, I think Carter delivered better than Biden has in a number of cases. When it comes to the message, Well, I mean, Carter can take a number of knocks.
July 1979. We're going to get to the crisis of confidence speech in a little bit. But why don't we start at the beginning of their terms? General overview of the landscape in 1977 and in 2021. The mood in the country as Carter and Biden take office. A Democrat coming into the White House after an outrageously corrupt Republican administration put the country through a nightmarish experience. Referring to Nixon, not Ford, but Nixon's ghost haunted the Ford administration. This new president promising to unify the country, restore dignity to the office, restore public confidence in the White House. What do you think of the way I'm framing this?
Well, yeah, and I think you got to throw more into the mix, though. When Carter comes into office, this is a country that's going through a period of transition. You've got not just the Watergate scandal and of course, also the claims about us winning the war in Vietnam, which raised the credibility gap. You've got an economy that is running into some problems. Inflation was up, unemployment was up. There were concerns the presidency had become too strong. There was a social and political backlash, conservative social and political backlash coming out of anger against the liberal policies that trace back to the New Deal, plus concerns about some of the movements of the 1960s that many social conservatives believed were pushing the nation in the wrong direction morally. And Carter was able to play into all of that by talking about the fact that he was an outsider, that he was not corrupted by the establishment, he was not affected by these scandals, and somebody who could bring the nation together, someone who talked both language that appealed to conservatives, but also language that appealed to those liberals who were still hoping for those liberal policies to continue. And so, yes, there was that hope he could be that unifier.
Neither man really enjoyed much of a honeymoon, though.
I would say that the biggest difference here is that when Carter comes into office, political polarization that we see today was still in its infancy.
There was no Fox News or right-wing online media ecosystem.
But also, I mean, if we look at the Republican Party, for instance, there was still, and some of your listeners may take offense to what I'm going to say here, but there was a liberal wing of the Republican Party. True. There was a moderate wing of the Republican Party. It's very hard today to find moderates and liberals among Republicans today. They're oftentimes charged with being rhinos. Among Democrats, you also were seeing some divisions taking place between the New Deal coalition that was hoping to continue those liberal policies, but also a growing conservatism that was appearing among Democrats. But again, all of this was still fairly young. Biden comes into office when that political polarization has matured, and it is nasty. Words like bipartisanship and compromise have really become dirty words. You don't hear them very often. And that was not something Carter had to deal with. It certainly was something Biden's had to deal with.
And in Carter's day, people tended to believe what they read. Maybe not so much after Vietnam, but you know what I mean.
Oh, yeah.
They tended to believe more so than they do now. What they see, I mean, depending on which is your favorite cable network or newspaper, it's either all BS or all the truth. You know what I mean. You know, you mentioned Carter and problems within the Democratic Party. He wasn't that liberal. You know, Biden is a New Deal liberal. It's funny. I mean, I said how they're both same generation, you know, give or take a few years. Biden comes to office in 2021, a New Deal liberal. At least that was his pedigree. But Carter didn't win the trust of liberals, did he?
No, and this ties into two things. Number one, the fact that Carter was in many ways very conservative. He was a social conservative. He was a fiscal conservative. He reflected this growing conservatism taking place in America. But there's something else about Carter, and that is Biden comes into office as somebody who was part of the Washington establishment. He understood how Washington worked. Carter came into office having run against the Washington establishment.
Jimmy Carter entered the Democratic presidential race a political unknown. Outside of Georgia, hardly anyone even recognized his name. But that would change.
This inauguration ceremony marks a new beginning, a new dedication within our government, and a new spirit among us all.
Ran as an outsider, and as such, he felt like he owed nothing to his own party. And they felt like they owed nothing to him because they got elected or reelected, not running on his coattails, but on their own. And one of the problems with Carter, and I can talk more about this if you'd like, is not only did he not understand how Washington worked, he didn't want to understand how Washington worked. And that caused him some serious problems from almost the get-go.
That's interesting because Carter, at least on paper, enjoyed large Democratic majorities in Congress, unlike Biden, who has a 50-50 Senate and an implacably hostile Republican opposition on most issues. Not all. He did get Republican votes for the transportation bill, for instance. But yeah, Carter had large Democratic majorities, but right off the bat, he was having trouble with them.
I think it's really important to remember that parties generally aren't monolithic. Not all Democrats agree with one another, and this was certainly the case back in the 1970s. I mean, you did have that New Deal coalition that was still around, that was hoping to continue moving things in that direction. But you do have this conservatism appearing among Democrats, as we see in the case of Jimmy Carter. And the very fact that he didn't want to play the Washington game. I mean, Tip O'Neill, who was the Speaker of the House from Massachusetts, said that Jimmy Carter didn't understand how Washington worked, and he didn't want to learn how it worked either. That causes some real problems. Add that to the mix of Carter comes into office seeing himself as a trustee of the American people. He believed that he knew what the American people wanted, and he expected Congress to follow his lead. Well, you've got Democrats out there who have their own constituencies, their own interests, who are going to say, time out, Mr. President. That's not how the game works. There has to be some give and take here.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I think Carter had. It's not that he didn't learn. He did. But he did not. He did not by any means enjoy the politicking involved.
To your point about parties not being monolithic, I always say politics was more interesting in those days. You couldn't guess automatically how a certain politician would vote on every issue based merely on his party affiliation or her party affiliation. And one other point, too, about Carter's anti-politics. You brought this up. Biden did come to office the ultimate insider after the term of someone who was the ultimate outsider, Donald Trump. So the analogy does not fit perfectly, but I think there is some terrain to explore here. So in his book, The Age of Reagan, Sean Wilentz writes, Carter's best day as president may have been his first. Was it really that bad for him after that?
There may be a little exaggeration there. I understand the point. Even at the end of Carter's first year in office, his approval rating was still running around 50%, which was better than Biden's was at that same time. But there's no doubt that Carter ran into a lot of problems. Some of them were not of his own making. For instance, coming into office at a time when there's high inflation, coming into office at a time when there's this conservative backlash against the direction the country was going. Carter also created his own problems, and I may be going beyond what you're asking here, but
no, go ahead.
One of Carter's problems, and this ties in with his lack of understanding of how Washington worked, and also the fact that he saw himself as a trustee, is he wanted to get everything done at once. This is something I think Biden understands you can't do. William Quandt, who worked for the National Security Council under Jimmy Carter, said that we would give Carter a list of 20 initiatives, and we would say to him, if you hope to get any of these done, you can only check mark 2 or 3 of them. So just check mark the 2 or 3 that you believe are most important, and we'll run with them. Well, take a guess how many Carter check marked.
All of them?
L20.
Oh, well, there you go.
Yeah.
Not realistic. No, that's funny. I don't want to interrupt here, but just one
Sure.
point, then you can continue with your point. Biden has been taking heat from the left in his party for not getting enough done, even though he only has, a 50-50 Senate and a few seat majority in the House. But in a year and a half, he's gotten a lot of his ambitious legislative agenda through, whereas Carter did not.
You can look at, for instance, the infrastructure bill that he got passed, Inflation Reduction Act, aid for veterans who were affected by these burn pits and the like. Carter, it's more, I guess, as we get toward his second year where Carter begins to have more successes. But if you look at his first year, let me just give your listeners, this is just a partial list, okay? This is just a partial list of what Carter proposed in 1977, all right? Reforming the tax code, reforming the nation's welfare system, containing the cost of hospital stays, eliminating some water projects like dams that Carter felt were not necessary, environmental legislation, energy legislation, pursuing the Panama Canal treaties to turn the Panama Canal over to Panama, pursuing SALT II, an arms agreement with the Soviet Union, withdrawing U.S. troops from South Korea, pursuing peace in the Middle East. That's 10 items right there, and that's not a complete list. Every one of those items required some form of congressional input, even congressional legislation.
And at a time when Congress was trying to rein in the power of the executive after what happened with Watergate.
That, plus the fact that the congressional calendar is only so long, and you can't do all of these things. But Carter's position was, and I'm almost quoting him word for word, it was better to get 95% of what you want than just an awful 5% of what you really want. Well, but if you ask for all these things, you won't even get 5% of what you want to get because you're just asking Congress to do too much. I think Biden understands how Congress works much better, but you're absolutely right. Biden does face a party itself that is facing these divisions between a more moderate wing and this progressive wing that wants to move the party in a different direction. And trying to keep all those wings together has been difficult, but Biden has in recent months had some successes. Now, what that ultimately means down the road is something else we can talk about.
One president's success is the other party's disaster, so not everyone agrees that these are achievements, but
exactly.
Nonetheless, he is getting a good part of his agenda through in a year and a half, despite not having a large or any majority in the Senate. And of course, basically needing 60 votes on a lot of things with the filibuster. So Willentz wrote, no less than Gerald Ford, Carter faced large problems that defied conventional wisdom. And he had even worse luck than his predecessor. A new energy crisis, compounded once again by treacherous turns in foreign affairs, brought stagflation back with a vengeance. And we're talking about stagflation again today in 2022, although we're not there yet.
Right.
What was stagflation and why was it so hard to deal with?
Stagflation is when you have inflation, rising prices with little or no economic growth. And this was something fairly new. I mean, this had just appeared in the early 1970s. Traditional views said, okay, if you're dealing with an economic problem, if you're dealing with inflation, well, one of the ways you deal with that is, for instance, by cutting spending. To try to deal with stagflation, there was no traditional resolution to the problem. Cutting spending might bring down inflation, but is that going to stimulate economic growth, which oftentimes was believed you got by increasing spending? Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter all dealt with this problem. And just to compound Carter's problems, and this is the same thing his predecessor Ford dealt with, if you're going to have inflation plus little or no economic growth, then you're going to have two things at the same time: rising prices and high unemployment. Which do you want to deal with? Because it's going to be hard to try to deal with both at the same time. When Carter ran for office, he gave the impression unemployment will be his number one priority.
We've got 8.5 million people out of work that are looking for jobs. And we've got another 2 or 3 million that have given up hope of getting jobs, another 1.5 million on welfare that have never looked for jobs because they don't have the motivation or understanding. So the emphasis ought to be on full production, I think, in our country.
He gets into office, being a fiscal conservative, he says, no, I've changed my mind. Inflation will be my number one priority.
The government has been spending too great a portion of what our nation produces. During my campaign, I promised to cut the government share of our total national spending from 23%, which it was then, to 21% in fiscal year 1981.
Well, that's not going to please Democratic constituencies like labor unions, for instance, or African Americans who are expecting him to pump more money in the economy to deal with unemployment. But that Carter said would also contribute to more inflation. So again, I know I'm going maybe long here.
That's all right.
But it represents the kind of difficulties that one has when dealing with stagflation. How do you combat inflation and unemployment at the same time when the traditional methods of dealing with inflation and unemployment, when dealing with inflation and economic growth, didn't seem to work?
We're having that same problem now with the Fed, right? It has one tool that doesn't appear to be all that effective in bringing inflation under control: incremental interest rate hikes. In Carter's day, Volcker came on the scene. He hiked interest rates, and banks raised their, I'm not an economist, so this is not going to be an economically sound definition, raised their basic rate to 14.5%. And the results were kind of mixed.
Well, I mean, we went into a recession.
Yeah.
There are some individuals out there who argue that had Volcker done this in 1977, that yes, we would have had a very difficult time, but by 1979, 1980, the economy would have been turning around, which would have been beneficial to Carter. But the problem Carter faced here is, how do you tame inflation? And in this case, the inflation was being driven by many of the same things we're facing today: high oil prices, high energy prices. You can throw in the mix as well what's happening in the Ukraine, which is also affecting inflation rates. So how do you tame it? Well, one way you do that is by raising interest rates. That raises concern that you can slow down the economy and lead us into a recession or stagflation. We'll have to see, because one of the things that makes Biden different from Carter in this respect is Biden comes into office at a time when we're all dealing with COVID. And so you have Americans who are coming out of a COVID pandemic who have not been able to travel, who have not been able to go out and eat a lot, who have not been able to, because of supply chain issues, maybe buy a new vehicle. And so they had all that pent up money that they could now spend. And that, too, is contributing to inflation. That's not something Carter had to deal with.
So in terms of style, Carter did try to strike what you might call a down-home or homespun style with voters.
Jimmy Carter knows what it's like to work for a living. Until he became governor, he put in 12 hours a day in his shirt sleeves during harvest at his farm. Can you imagine any of the other candidates for president working in the hot August?
And then at one point he started wearing a sweater during the energy crisis because he didn't want people to turn the heat up, I guess, too much in there.
Simply by keeping our thermostats, for instance, at 65 degrees in the daytime and 55 degrees at night, we could save half the current shortage of natural gas.
And Biden has been known for his empathy, right? Mm-hmm. But I think both men struggled for different reasons to connect at times.
I think there's some truth to that. If we look at, again, Jimmy Carter, there is this style. Here's a guy who, when he's walking to his inaugural address, gets out of the limo and walks with his family as to suggest, I'm not above you guys. I'm one of you. And I'm willing to walk with my family on the way to the Capitol building. But Carter's problem is, again, comes back to the whole question of vision. He was trained as an engineer. He could talk policy proposals, and he could do so in great detail. But what was the ultimate purpose of those policies? What was the larger vision? What was the larger purpose of all of them? That's where Carter, I think, struggled. Biden, yes, he is very empathetic, but he faces this polarization taking place in American politics where, everything is suspect.
And also, not to be unkind about Biden, but he is old and somewhat faded. Carter was 55 when he took office. Biden is pushing 80.
Well, I think there are two issues here. Yeah. One is that, yes, the issue of age is an issue, one that we need to look at, I think, very carefully. My father is 81 years old. He says, look, I'm very forgetful at times. I think maybe there should be a limit on how old a president is, how old a person should be to run for office. Here's a guy who's quite liberal who's saying this. The other issue I think that needs to be asked is, two issues that need to be asked. Number one is, actually, they both tie into the issue of polarization of politics. You don't hear that a lot coming from the right about Donald Trump. And yet, here's a guy, Donald Trump, who couldn't remember where his own father was from, who talked about how he won an award in Michigan but never won that award. And there are other examples that I can talk about as well. So does age apply to him? Mm-hmm. But the other question that should be asked is, in this politicized age we're in, does it matter how old a person is? Because no matter what they say, the other side's going to see it as suspect.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I remember years ago.
Well, I think your point is that the other side's going to operate in bad faith no matter what.
Well, I remember years ago when Rush Limbaugh was on, I think it was the CBS's morning show, and Katie Couric asked him a question, read him a quote, and asked him, what do you think about that? His response was, well, it depends who said it. And I think there's a lot of that today.
So what happens in the 1978 midterm elections?
1978 is very interesting because Carter had been struggling by that point. He's trying to get energy legislation through that's not getting through. Inflation is still remaining a problem. Even by April of 78, Carter's approval rating has fallen down to about 29%. There's talk that Democrats rather have Edward Kennedy as their candidate come 1980. So Carter's taken a beating because of that, but he's also taking a beating because of his foreign policy decisions. His support for the Panama Canal treaties, which to a good number of Americans was seen as taking away from the United States and giving to Panama something the U.S., as Ronald Reagan put it, something the U.S. paid for and built and belonged to us. The fact that Jimmy Carter wanted to improve relations with the Soviet Union, which a good number of people on the more conservative side said, hold on a second, you can't deal with these people, you can't trust them. So you put all this together, a lack of success, inflation continuing, these foreign policy decisions. And in 1978, Democrats take a hit. Now, here's the interesting thing. Democrats do lose seats, especially liberal Democrats lose seats, but they still were able to maintain control of Congress. What you also see, however, is a growing number of conservatives winning seats in Congress, which is further proof of this conservative movement taking place in America at that time.
You brought up Trump before. Carter did not have Gerald Ford publicly railing against him every single day, claiming that he didn't really win the election in 1977. No. But Carter had Ted Kennedy to deal with. We're going to get to the 1980 DNC, the convention, and Kennedy's role and the liberal wing's role in hurting Carter's chances against Reagan. Mm-hmm. But let's talk about 1979. Because, as you've been explaining, Carter's first couple of years in the White House aren't going very well. But 1979, I mean, my goodness. Year begins with the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Carter's man, the U.S. man in Iran, the Shah, goes down. Carter badly misjudged that situation. But the hostage crisis does not start until much later in the year. It's in July of 1979 where Jimmy Carter goes into seclusion, right, at Camp David, am I correct? Where he's thinking about how he wants to kind of reset his presidency and deliver a speech. Before we get to the speech itself, what's Carter's thinking here in these days where he's in seclusion?
He was really debating what to do about the energy crisis. OPEC had raised oil prices again. Inflation was still rampant. And despite the fact that he had some successes in 1978, such as, yes, he did get an energy bill passed, although didn't do as much as he was hoping. Yes, you have the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel. Yes, arguably the Panama Canal treaties. The fact was that inflation was continuing to dog him. And so he was trying to figure out, what should I say? And so he was bringing in labor leaders, bringing in members of the African American Civil Rights Movement, bringing in members of Congress, bringing in business leaders to try to figure out what he should say. And most members of his administration said, what you should do is you should talk about policy issues. Here's what I plan to do in terms of policy to deal with these problems. But his pollster said, no. What you need to do is talk about a crisis of spirit facing America. Americans are tired of policy proposals. Talk about a crisis of spirit.
That was Patrick Cadell, right? Patrick
Cadell, who later worked for Donald Trump, by the way. And so Carter listened, and against the advice of many of his advisors, he said, that's what I'm going to go with.
That's interesting because President Biden just had a bunch of historians, including Sean Wilentz, at the White House to discuss the problems facing American democracy. So, July 15, 1979, Americans are in their living rooms. I guess they had color TVs at that point. Well, yeah, definitely 1979. Not everyone. So, Americans in their living rooms, they turn on their TVs to hear the president address the nation. He starts off by, well, I'll let you pick it up from here, basically scolding Americans for a soulless materialism. They weren't expecting that, were they?
No. I mean, a lot of it was, yes, we're too materialistic. We're too focused on ourselves. We need to come together as a people if we hope to deal with these crises, these combined crises of energy and inflation.
Because the situation was bad in the country at that time. People were standing on lines for gas. There was a shortage of gasoline. But he goes into this, well, a sermon. It was a sermon about a crisis of confidence.
It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation.
Yes, which became known as the malaise speech, even though he never used the word. So yes, he did criticize the American people.
Too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. Human identity is no longer defined by what one does, but by what one owns.
Now, notice you used the word scolded. What's interesting is that his approval rating actually went up 11 points after giving that speech. It was well received by the American people.
At first.
At first. What happened was Carter then made a massive mistake. He decided to make some changes to his administration to start anew. So he ends up firing about half of his cabinet.
It's amazing.
That happens within days after this. And so what he's done is he's taken the goodwill that he's earned from the American people for this speech, fired half of his cabinet, and now the American people are going, what in the world is going on? This administration is falling apart. And it only added to Carter's woes. It's an example of mistakes he made. It's also an example of his lack of understanding of how politics worked. He really is, in many ways, the anti-political politician.
You know, the speech was well written, and maybe he was right about this, although you hear this almost every generation, how, we've lost our way, we're too concerned about material things and, the soul of the nation, all of that stuff. I actually watched the entire speech before connecting the call with you. And what did you think of, or what do you think of the speech?
I've watched the entire speech as well. It is lengthy, it is sermonistic. It represents Jimmy Carter and the type of person he was. It was well delivered, I'll give you that. And you could make the argument that it was in some ways prophetic. He was kind of foreseeing problems down the road that would happen if we didn't deal with these problems now. But I think a problem that Carter had, and this is something that can be a criticism against the speech, is while he did earn the goodwill of the American people, and while he did undermine a lot of that through firing of half of his cabinet, 5 members of his cabinet, what I think also hurt him with regard to that speech is one of the things Americans want is to be uplifted.
That's right. And it's his job to fix the problems that he's railing against.
Yes. And what that is, it's really a negative speech if you think about it a while. We're at fault. You're at fault. Well, while at first Americans might say, okay, yeah, maybe I need to change my ways, that's not ultimately a very happy, a very uplifting vision.
Because then you're the next day going to get gasoline and you say, hold on a second here. The president is saying I'm spending too much money on fun stuff and,
Right. And so, in the short term, it helped Carter. But I think ultimately my personal opinion is that what you're talking about is exactly what would have happened. A growing number of Americans would have said, hold on a second. We can jump back and draw an analogy here. The Whip Inflation Now campaign that Gerald Ford talked about with regard to fighting inflation, voluntary campaign to fight inflation. And while many Americans would say, yeah, I would love to do what I can to help, Mr. President, what are you doing? And that's where I think Carter ran into problems.
I'm not sure how old you are. I was too young to pay attention to Gerald Ford's presidency. I was born in 1975. I don't think I got a win pin.
We must whip inflation right now.
They were giving out pins for that.
Yeah, well, they were win pins. Yeah, I was only 6 years old at the time of win. So
maybe
I was young
myself. Maybe you got a Whip Inflation Now pin for one of your early birthdays there. I thought of Biden's speech the other night when I was preparing for this conversation, his Fate of Democracy speech. Similar to what Carter tried to do, insofar a major address, get at the heart of what's eating away at the American body politic, right? Different speeches. Carter's wasn't all that partisan. Biden's was highly partisan, but the more I think as the days pass, and you're talking about how Carter's speech was initially well received, but as the days passed, it wasn't. As the days pass, I'm souring more and more on Biden's presentation. Not that he's wrong about what some factions inside the Republican Party are trying to do to democracy, but I just thought the whole speech, it wasn't charitable, it was dark. He kind of was shouting it. And I don't know, I just thought that maybe he belonged in the Oval Office, look into the camera, empathize with us, and talk broadly about the challenges of American democracy rather than launching into a laundry list of Democratic policy proposals. This is more of a word salad than a question, Scott, but go ahead.
Well, that speech is Biden's speech, I think, is unique in a number of respects. First of all, when Jimmy Carter gave his speech, I mean, it had the attention of media in general. I mean, you didn't have all these additional networks. It was played on all the major networks.
That's
Biden's
right.
speech, I think it was just on MSNBC and CNN.
Yeah, it was
So
just on cable, not on the networks,
Yeah, and the major networks weren't showing it. It was a very partisan speech. I cannot think of another speech in American history where a sitting president attacked by name a predecessor like Biden did.
As if to give Trump some magical power that he's still in charge. You know, obviously is still an influential figure, but yeah, go ahead.
But it was a very political speech as well. I mean, there are at least two things that I know were in Biden's mind. One is the fact that you do have about 3/4 of the American people, including about 1/4 of Republicans, who believe that democracy is in jeopardy. And so he saw this as a way to play to that audience. But also, we are in a midterm election year. Jimmy Carter was not. He is trying to appeal to as many voters as possible because he does see opportunity here. Inflation's going down. He has had these victories in Congress. His approval rating is starting to tick up a little bit. Still not great. But
Gas
ticking up.
prices have been going down.
Yes. So by doing this, he is hoping to get the support of not just Democrats, but independents and maybe even some of those Republicans to support him.
Those critical voters who seem to decide those elections in the purple regions of the country, right?
Yeah, and especially when you have, I mean, the belief was just a few months ago that Republicans would probably win 40 or 60 seats in the House and maybe even capture the Senate. Now it's looking like that Democrats are not just holding the Senate, but maybe win some seats there, and that if Democrats do lose seats in the House, it's not going to be nearly as many as originally believed. So by giving this speech, Biden's hoped to shore up that support and earn additional support. But yes, it was a very, very partisan speech, nothing like it that I can think of in American history.
Because Democrats are not perfect either when it comes to preserving democracy. And he didn't mention anything there. And, you know, Trump is an unpopular figure. His approval ratings were never very high when he was president. And I wouldn't say he's a very popular figure now. I mean, among his loyalists, yes, but not among the general public. You know, but Biden is not a popular figure either. His approval ratings are really low.
But that's another reason for giving the speech, is by mentioning Trump's name, Biden can look at the polls and he can see, Trump is very unpopular when it comes to a general election. I think I've got a better chance against Trump than I do somebody like maybe DeSantis. So there's a number of things behind that speech. And I'm not saying that I was happy with the speech itself. I understand why he gave it.
It's not a malaise moment, at least not yet. So Sean Wilentz writes in his book about this period of Carter's presidency, and this is before the hostage crisis. The main question on Americans' minds seemed no longer to be tied to any specific issue, but rather to whether Jimmy Carter was competent to address any issue at all. And, you know, the analogy here, both men, Carter and Biden, appearing to, lose the narrative a bit, then trying to win it back with a major speech. Then November happens, 1979, the Iran hostage crisis, and in echoes of today's 24/7 media coverage, that's on TV every single day, right? I mean, doesn't Nightline come out of that?
This is an ABC News special. The Iran crisis. America held hostage.
Hostage crisis, day 51, day 52, day 53, and Carter begins to look hapless in the face of this crisis.
Could you tell us how the tide is being turned in the case of the American hostages in Tehran?
Well, we haven't made adequate progress there. What we've done since the very beginning is to try to protect the lives and safety of those hostages from the original threats that they would be tried and executed, to build up on a worldwide basis support for our position, the condemnation of Iran, and the calling on the Iranian government to protect those hostages and to release them.
It doesn't help him. Now, his original thought, I don't know if you're aware of this, there had actually been an earlier crisis, a hostage crisis, in February of 79. Some Americans in the U.S. Embassy were taken hostage, but it lasted a very short time. I think it only lasted about a week. So Carter figured this might last for a very short time as well. But you're right. The problem is it went on and on and on. And while Americans at first rallied around Carter and his approval rating went up, which was actually good for him because by this time, Ted Kennedy had jumped into the race against him. While Carter's approval rating went up, it did begin to go down as Americans said, Mr. President, what are you going to do about this? Why are you just sitting on your duff? Get up and get our people out.
And he tried.
He tried, and he failed.
After my order to do so, 2 of our American aircraft collided on the ground following a refueling operation in a remote desert location in Iran. There was no fighting, there was no combat, but to my deep regret, 8 of the crewmen of the 2 aircraft which collided were killed.
And of course, you can add to that the fact that the instability in Iran, combined with the decision of OPEC once again to jack up oil prices, is once again causing inflation in this country. Inflation's reaching, by the end of 79, inflation's running around 11.35%. So,
you got it down to 2 decimal there, 11.35.
Yeah, I was looking at some numbers before I talked to you. Double digits. And the frustration that Americans are feeling, same kind of thing we just had happen in this country within the last few months. Those high gas prices, the same kind of anger. And this is what was dogging Carter. And Americans are asking, Mr. President, you can't get our hostages out. The inflation's running rampant. We're having all of these problems here in this country. Why can't you seem to solve it? And so, yes, Americans were asking serious questions about Carter's competence.
The president has very little control over gas prices, but if they go up on your watch, you're going to take the heat for that. And it's compounded by the fact there's not much you can do to bring them down. Not in the short term, maybe in the long term, yes. I mean, that's what Carter had been talking about with changing energy policy in the United States, developing different ways of fueling the economy. And he actually mentions this in the malaise speech. He said, I've already talked to you a number of times about the energy crisis. I think he said 6 different addresses from the White House. And you must be wondering, why can't we solve this problem? I'm sure Americans, nodded back at their TV. Yes, exactly. You keep talking to us about this problem, which reminds us that it has not been solved yet. So we're getting near the end here of Carter's 1 term in office, and I started this conversation talking about a June 12th New York Times front page article about how Democrats within the party are whispering that they don't want Biden to run for a 2nd term. But in 1980, it was open rebellion led by Ted Kennedy.
Yes.
Was this a principled crusade by Kennedy, the liberal lion who wanted to have a liberal Democrat himself in the White House, or was there something more personal here?
It's both, yeah. First of all, Kennedy was upset with Carter because he felt like Carter was not adopting policies and promoting policies that Kennedy and many on the left wanted. The best example of this would be national health care, a national health insurance system. Kennedy wanted to implement very quickly that would provide care in the case of a serious accident, for instance, for all Americans. And Carter said, look, what you're asking me to do here would be very expensive. You want it instituted very quickly. We can't do that. I'm willing to talk to you about something, but something of a smaller scale. This reflects Carter's fiscal conservatism. And Kennedy was very upset that Carter was not prepared to follow his lead on national health insurance. But there's also a personality conflict here as well. Kennedy felt like Carter could be very sermonistic. He didn't like the trusteeship attitude that Jimmy Carter had. And so Kennedy decides, you know what? This is not the guy, and I'm going to run against him, and I think I have a good chance of beating him. So, yes, there was an open rebellion against the president, and Kennedy gave Carter a pretty serious run for his money.
The speech at the Democratic National Convention, that was, well, I guess that was not a team effort.
No. In fact, Kennedy had to be really coaxed to get up on the stage, and you could tell he was very uncomfortable there.
He didn't really support Carter in that speech, right? He didn't say, okay, I gave it my best, now let's all rally behind Carter, or did he? Or did he try to have it both ways?
There was definite lack of comfort there in that speech. I mean, and it was apparent to even viewers that Kennedy is doing this because he feels he really has no choice, but he is by no means a fan of Carter.
And I say again, as I have before, if health insurance is good enough for the president, the vice president, the Congress of the United States, then it's good enough for you and every family in America. There were some who said we should be silent about our differences on issues during this convention. But the heritage of the Democratic Party has been a history of democracy.
Amazing, because today the conventions are stage managed, where you go up there and the candidate is, the second coming. In those days, you had Ted Kennedy basically bashing the incumbent president.
He certainly wasn't the happiest person there. It was apparent, and it reflected this growing divide within the Democratic Party.
How much damage did it do to the party?
Kennedy's speech?
The speech and the campaign to make Carter a one-term president.
I mean, it certainly didn't help Carter the same way that Reagan's campaign against Ford in '76 didn't help, because it forced Carter to divert time and resources to fending off the Kennedy challenge, just like it did with Ford against the Reagan challenge. But it also reflected these deep divisions that were taking place within the party, and Carter was having a very difficult time overcoming those divisions.
I may have overstated things a bit. Sean Wilentz, writing here in his book, The Age of Reagan, Kennedy offered Carter at best a lukewarm endorsement and barely acknowledged the president's presence during the ritual show of unity at the finale of the convention.
But again, a lukewarm endorsement is not exactly an endorsement. It's saying, yeah, I'm for you, okay.
Compared to today, where everybody's all on the same team because winning is all that really matters. So if Carter's presidency, if the beginning of that, we could say, is Gerald Ford's "our long national nightmare is over," Watergate, Carter takes office, he gets out of his car, as you mentioned, walks down Pennsylvania Avenue, a breath of fresh air. If that's the beginning, in my mind, the end is the debate, October 28, 1980, with Ronald Reagan, where Reagan delivers one of the most memorable lines in U.S. political history.
Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Is it easier for you to go and buy things in the stores than it was 4 years ago? Is there more or less unemployment in the country than there was 4 years ago? Is America as respected throughout the world as it was? Do you feel that our security is as safe, that we're as strong as we were 4 years ago?
And Carter's closing statements in that same debate were, ordinary, what you would expect an incumbent president to say when things in the country aren't going so well. But that was Reagan's gift, his ability to communicate.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we have a guy here who's an actor who understands how to use the camera. I mean, one thing that was said about Ronald Reagan is he could look in that camera and make you, the viewer, feel like he's talking directly to you. He had that connection. But something else about Reagan that helped him, aside from the famous line that you're talking about, he had a vision. And it was a very simple vision. He said, look, the problems we are facing today, inflation, unemployment, the hostage crisis, we haven't talked yet about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in '79. All of these problems we're facing have very simple solutions. And I am the person who can bring those simple solutions and restore American greatness. It was a very positive message. It was a simple message. It resonated with the American voters, even with constituencies that historically voted Democrat, like labor unions said, Reagan's my guy. And he won in a landslide.
How could any incumbent president have overcome what Carter was facing? Even if you say none of it was his fault. I mean, you can't say that, right? But even if you were to grant him, all right, you had a lot of bad luck here, but...
Well, I mean, there's a work guy named Skowronek who argues that there are these periods in American history where coalitions break down, and then you got to find a president who can build a new coalition. Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal coalition. Ronald Reagan developed a conservative coalition. And that Jimmy Carter came at the end of this breakdown of the New Deal coalition, which would have been made it almost impossible for any president to succeed.
That's right. The New Deal liberalism was a spent force. It seemed to be out of answers for the problems.
Yes, yeah, but the key point there is almost impossible. Doesn't mean impossible. And this is why I'm more critical of Carter than a good number of scholars are, especially more recent scholars. I believe that Carter made a number of major mistakes that he could have easily overcome. One would be, for instance, the messaging that we've talked about. The second would be that prioritization of policies rather than just dumping a bunch of stuff onto Congress. But a third thing that Carter lacked was good managerial skills. He wanted to run his administration by what was known as a spokes-in-the-wheel style system, where there was no chief of staff to decide who saw the president, who didn't. He wanted everybody to be able to come see him, which sounds nice, but that means you're being constantly inundated by people. And then he gave his cabinet enormous amounts of power over what their agencies did, what their departments did, which sounds nice. But because there was no overarching vision, no overarching direction from the top, you ended up with this fighting among these different departments over what direction the administration should take. All these things just compounded Carter's problems.
Yeah, Americans will forgive presidents for a mistake or two and won't blame you for things that are outside of your control. To a point, right? I mean, I did mention high gas prices before and how that can hurt a president's popularity. But when it looks like you have lost control of events or you're not leading anymore, that's where you run into problems.
Right. I mean, Carter tried to run a Rose Garden campaign, for instance, which he believed would show that he's leading because he's staying back in Washington, D.C., but then he's not out in the stump. Now, there were no easy solutions. I mean, there was talk, for instance, the administration of maybe bombing Tehran to get the hostages out. Well, but Carter feared that would lead to the hostages' deaths. They'd be killed.
Well, in a final twist of irony, it was Carter's negotiations that eventually freed the hostages. But the Iranians waited until Reagan had taken office that day.
A slap in the face against Carter. Absolutely. They waited until just after Reagan was inaugurated before the plane took off, bringing the hostages back.
Well, the Iranians despised Carter and his administration for supporting the Shah for as long
Absolutely
as they
did.
So,
they did.
So in closing, I think our listeners can decide whether these comparisons hold any water. I think yes and no. I think there are some valuable parallels here. I don't think we're going to see a Ted Kennedy-style insurgency in a couple of years. I'm not sure Biden, that is, will run for a second term yet. It's just too soon, and we're only a year and a half in. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Well, that's one thing I've been thinking about. I've been wondering myself, could we see someone from the progressive wing challenging Biden if he decides to run for a second term? If you had asked me that question a few months ago, I probably would have said, yes, I think it's very possible because Biden was becoming so unpopular. Today, I'm not so sure. But I do think
things look better for him right now.
They do. But, we're still 2 years out. We don't know what's going to happen following the midterms. It's very possible that the midterms, Biden may say, you know what, I am going to call it quits and let somebody else run.
It's true. If he's out there campaigning now to try to help Democrats win and hold off a Republican wave and it's a disaster, well, then he might say, okay, this is my opportunity to say I tried, it didn't work, and I will not run for a second term. I was a stable bridge after the Trump years to the next generation of Democratic leaders, whoever they may be.
Right. So, and we also don't know if he does decide to run again, how the country will look in 2023, even 2024. If things begin to go sour again, he does become unpopular, could we see somebody from the progressive wing saying, time out, enough is enough? Given the length of presidential campaigns.
Yeah, 2 years long, ridiculous.
Yeah, they would have to make a decision fairly soon.
Yeah, that's the issue here, right? You mean they have to start raising money and getting out there?
There's a professor who wrote a book on the modern American presidency who argues about the constant campaign, that the moment a president wins office, he begins campaigning for the next term. And it's unfortunate. I would love to see us, this is just me getting my own soapbox here. Okay. I would love to see us get rid of big money interests. I'd love to see us get rid of gerrymandering. It takes too much power out of the hands of the average voter. Yeah. But that's just a dream of mine. I know there are a lot of hurdles to overcome in that case to try to do those things.
I'll just say any predictions I make probably will not come true. No one listens to me for political prognostication. Last question. Was Jimmy Carter the worst Democratic president of the 20th century?
That's a very tough question. If I had to think about all the Democrats of the 20th century, I probably would say, yeah, he was very likely the least successful. I would put it that way, the most mediocre of those presidents. But, there's always the but, Carter is getting a second look by a new generation of scholars who are saying, you know what, he wasn't so bad. But among Democrats in the 20th century, I think he would probably finish at the bottom.
Scott Kaufman, we thank you for your insights about Jimmy Carter and Joe Biden. On the next episode of History as It Happens, what is semi-fascism?
The MAGA Republicans don't just threaten our personal rights and economic security. They're a threat to our very democracy. They refuse to accept the will of the people. They embrace political violence. They don't believe in democracy.
In American politics today, the word fascism is everywhere. But are there any actual fascists? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.